So let me start with a land acknowledgement. The USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research acknowledges our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva people and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, the Tate Weam, Kutawin Nemok, Sirano, Ko Wiu, Payom Kavichum, Auhashimin, Komiai, and Kushan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region we now call Southern California for thousands of years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respect to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain stewards, caretakers, and advocates of these lands, river systems, and the borders and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. And I want to add, for a more detailed history and land acknowledgement, you can go to the website of the History Department of the University of Southern California, where we put a much more elaborate acknowledgement. So again, welcome to this event, which is the first event for this semester and for the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. The Center for Advanced Genocide Research is an interdisciplinary center to study Holocaust and genocide, with a program of international conferences and also with an endowed fellowship program where we bring junior and senior scholars from everywhere on the globe to study with the testimonies of survivors of genocide. Today it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Lorena Sekwan Fontaine. She is a Cree-Anishnaabe and a member of the Sagkeeng First Nation in Manitoba, Canada. She is an associate professor in Indigenous Studies at the University of Winnipeg, Canada. And currently she is living close to us in San Diego, because she is the Fulbright Canada Research Chair at the San Diego State University in American Indian Studies. It is my particular pleasure to introduce her because she is the co-organizer of the Center's International Conference, Mass Violence and Its Lasting Impact on Indigenous Peoples, the Case of the Americas and Australia-Pacific Region, which will be held at USC in October. So that's we worked for quite a while on this conference, and it was supposed to happen when the pandemic started, and we had to postpone it twice, but cross your fingers that we can do it now in October. Lorena Fontaine has a PhD and an LLB from the University of Manitoba, an LLM from the University of Arizona, and a bachelor from the University of Winnipeg. She has taught at the First Nations University of Canada and the School of Public Policy graduate program at Queen's University. Her research includes the legacy of the boarding schools, cultural genocide, and indigenous language rights. She is the co-founder and co-director of the Indigenous Language Program, and her most recent publication is an article, Listening to First Nations Women's Expressions of Hearth Health, published in the International Journal of Circumpolar Health, which shows kind of the breadth of her interdisciplinary work. And she is preparing a book with the title, Our Language Are Sacred, Finding a Constitutional Space for Aboriginal Language Rights to Education, which is forthcoming with McGill Queen's University Press. She has presented her research nationally and internationally, and her research was even featured in a documentary entitled Undoing Linguicide, which was awarded the 2017 Radio Television Digital News Associate Adrienne Clarkson Award for Diversity, Radio and Network. Her most recent research includes a digital storytelling project for children of residential school survivors, and another research project which uses oral history and arts-based research to approach and explore culturally rooted knowledge concerning oppressive mechanisms which influence the caring for one's hearts among First Nations women. So please give a warm hand to our presenter, Lorena Fontaine.
Bonjour, Maigan Giji Conditionakas, Maigan and Judan, Sagkeeng First Nation. I just wanted to introduce myself in my ancestral language, which is Ojibwe. On my father's side, that's the language that we speak. On my mother's side, we speak the Cree language. My spirit name is Wolf Sky Woman, and I'm a member of the Wolf Clan. And I am learning to speak my language, but it is a journey that I've been on now just for a very short period of time, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is. Before I begin, I just want to just express my deep gratitude to Wolf and Martha and Maya and others that have organized to put on this lecture. I know it takes a lot of people to put on lectures, especially during a pandemic, and now we're also using Zoom. So hello to people on Zoom as well. I'm also really grateful to be with people, because it's been a long time that I've been giving talks online, and it's so much more meaningful to see people's faces. So I'm grateful for all of you that are able to join in person. I'm going to talk about the language situation in Canada. It's a very personal topic for me. Both my parents as well as my grandparents were forced to attend residential schools, and I was only in my early 20s when I found out about this history. So prior to that, I had no knowledge of what a boarding school or residential school was. I had no idea the extensive history that it had on Indigenous peoples in Canada and the US, but also I didn't know the personal impact that it had on my family's life, and the fact that my family of my generation, so my siblings and my cousins, we're all living the legacy of the schools, but we're not aware of it. So the discussions around residential schools and genocide policies that occurred in Canada are fairly new topics, even in Canada. I can tell you when I go to Indigenous communities that there are still youth that are not learning this history in school. Canada is doing a much better job to try to implement the history of boarding schools and residential schools into the curriculum, but we still have a long way to go. So I decided to organize my talk around a very important person in my life who's in this picture, Theodore Fontaine. He's in the middle of those two boys there. And, you know, he was known as Theodore Fontaine. I called him Ted. And unfortunately, Ted just recently passed away, so I thought that in his memory that I would talk about redress and linguicide in his honor and in his memory. So what I'm going to do is weave his personal history into the issues around linguicide, but also redress that's happened in Canada. I just wanted to show you, so Ted and I are close family members. My father and him were first cousins, but in our tradition, he was my uncle. We are both members of the Sagkeeng First Nation, and I thought for some of you that might not know the geography of Canada, you'd like to see a map. So we are by a big lake. It's called Lake Winnipeg. We're in Manitoba. So I'm going to just show you. So if you see Canada, Manitoba is located north of North Dakota. And I'm a member of a community in Manitoba, but my mother's community, on my mother's side, we're from a northern community called the Apasquiat Cree-Nation, which is about a 6-hour drive from the reserve community that I'm from. And I just thought I'd show you. We're surrounded by lakes there. I'm going to refer to him as Ted, even though I know because that's how I refer to him. So Ted was born in 1941 in our community. And I'm going to talk about his earlier life, but I'm going to end talking about his life before he passed away as well. So Ted attended the Fort Alexander Residential School from 1948 to 58, so that was 10 years. The residential school was located in the reserve community, so he could actually see his house from the reserve. Which was not the case on my mother's side. They were put into a train and they were taken into the next province, which was probably about an 8-hour train ride away from the community. Both were not good situations, but Ted used to often say that it was tormenting. It was a very tormenting experience to be so close to his home, to be able to see his home and people in the community walk around when he wasn't able to leave the school. He actually went to 2 different residential schools. After he left the Fort Alexander Residential School, he went to the Assiniboia Indian Residential School from 1958 to 1960, which was located in the city of Winnipeg, where I live, and actually the school is not too far from where my house is. So the type of educational system that Ted was placed in was strongly influenced by what transpired here in the United States. The 1879 boarding school that was established in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, served as a model for residential schools in Canada. And so it served for hundreds of residential schools here in the U.S., but it also served for the schools that developed in Canada. The schools were established in Canada a little bit, they were established around the same time, but we have a longer period of the schools. The first ones that were established in Canada around the mid-1880s, and the last one closed in 1996. So the residential schools in Canada were established around a policy of assimilation and civilization. There was legislation that were drafted to support the residential school system. Here you see our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, that sort of set the stage for the policy of the schools. And I'll just read the quote here. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. So this is the kind of environment that children were placed in. The Indigenous children were not viewed as even human in some cases. The schools were designed to eradicate Indigenous children's language and culture. And they
the government wanted to ensure that there were no cultural, linguistic, political, or legal distinctions between Indigenous peoples in Canada for very racist reasons, but also they wanted the land. And in order to obtain the land, they had to deal with the First Peoples of the territory. And because we spoke a different language, we had territorial rights because of our prior use and occupation. The government wanted to work with children, and they thought that if they removed them from their home and cultural environment and raised them in the dominant language, that they would remove any distinctions from their Indigenous identity. Later on, there was a long-standing civil servant, Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs for a long period, and actually his period within the government was a significant time where the majority of policies and laws that were established from compulsory education all the way from laws that were established so that Indigenous peoples weren't allowed to hire lawyers for land rights cases and for any other cases that were violating the rights of Indigenous peoples. So, for example, if a parent wanted to take their child from the boarding school because they didn't want them to be there, they would face imprisonment or fine or both, because it was Duncan Campbell Scott had initiated legislation that required compulsory education in the schools, but also that it was a crime if parents did refuse to send their children there. So the getting rid of the Indian problem was the legal and cultural distinction that I was referring to earlier, but also Canada did not want Indigenous peoples to be around culturally or linguistically. So TED was first placed into this educational system, or so-called educational system. I don't think a lot of kids came out of that educational system educated. But he was brought into the Fort Alexander Residential School in 1948, ironically the same year as the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was implemented. Ted's parents were forced to leave him at the school by an order by the federal government, and he was 7 years old. When he arrived at the school, he only spoke our ancestral language, which is Ojibwe. And in his memoir, he talked about the impact that the school had on his language and cultural identity. And I'm just going to read an excerpt from his memoir. Once we were all in the playroom, I was playing on the floor with several friends, reliving a picture show we had seen at a movie night and using small objects like stones and pieces of wood to act as the cowboys. I was startled when Sister S., the supervisor that day, almost knocked me on my back as she wrapped her powerful bony arm around mine. I'd inadvertently said something in Ojibwe. She assumed I was referring to her when a couple of boys laughed at my comment. She yelled that she'd wash out my mouth with soap, but instead she dragged me to where she had been sitting. I was shoved into a closet behind her chair. It was under the stairs leading to the second floor, and it was used to store brooms and other cleaning materials. I don't remember how long I was there, but it seemed like an eternity. I was desperate. I tried to sit up, but I banged my head on the overhead stairs. I tried to see the light under the door. Hearing the sound of play outside the closet at least made me feel closer to my classmates. I clenched my eyes to visualize my cousin Dee. and me frolicking at Treaty Point. I stretched my legs, which rattled a pail in the closet, and then it upset. Sister S hissed at me to be quiet. At least her crackly voice reassured me that someone was nearby. I sobbed for a while, and to no avail, eventually she let me out. Her first words was "tiens," take that in French, followed by warning not to speak my savage language. As a young boy, I only spoke Ojibwe. I did know certain things in English from hearing them by others. My education in English was long and tedious, and the lessons sometimes very surprising. Spending time on a reserve and hearing Ojibwe had allowed the priests and others in authority to learn some of our language and sometimes understand the gist of our conversations. The nuns in particular would listen intently when we whispered and talked in Ojibwe. They'd pretend not to hear or understand us so as to catch us saying something they didn't like. I thought that when this was one of those reasons we couldn't speak our language, I learned that they thought it was a language of savages and not created by God. In his adult years, Ted reflected on the harm that this experience had caused him. He said that we became ashamed of having a culture. We became ashamed of having a language. Hearing all the time that it was a savage language, it wasn't real. It wasn't a real language, so we became ashamed of that. The sadness about it is we became ashamed of being Ojibwe. We became ashamed of being Indigenous. And that's the worst legacy that we've left our kids. So this legacy has been transferred on to my generation. I was the first generation in my family in 2 generations that didn't attend the schools. But we burden the legacy of shame. We also carry the legacy of not having the language passed on to us. And as is here in the US, Indigenous languages are endangered. And I'm just going to show you a map here of Canada. You can see that there are approximately 90 different Indigenous languages that were the original languages of the territory. They vary in degree of endangerment now. They predict that out of the 90 Indigenous languages that 3 will survive. Cree, which is the language on my mother's side that we speak, and Ojibwe is another one, the language on my father's side that we speak, and Inuktitut, so it's the language of the Inuit people up north. But I can tell you that if something is not done significantly in our educational system to correct the harms from the schools and other genocidal policies that occurred in Canada, that these languages will die as well. I went away for graduate school for a number of years, and communities outside of where I'm from, lots of language speakers. There's one community that's just a 15-minute drive from where I'm from, and there are no longer any speakers there anymore. So you can see how quickly in a generation you can lose speakers. And our educational system has a responsibility to revitalize these languages in schools as part of Redress, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So we range from speakers from about 100,000 from Cree. If you get down to the coastal area in British Columbia, which is just north of here, their languages are severely endangered, and there's likely about, in some communities, maybe 1 or 2 speakers left. Their focus right now is on documentation. So they're documenting the last speakers, they're recording them, they're trying to create dictionaries, whereas in the central area where I'm from, we still have a number of speakers, so our focus is on language programs for second language learners like myself that did not learn their language at home. So I just want to emphasize here that it wasn't just the boarding school or the residential school system that harmed Indigenous languages. We also had policies which removed Indigenous children from our communities and sent them to Europe, to the US. And so those children were they were disconnected from their communities and obviously did not learn their languages. But the dominant school system, which is still very much a part of how we educate our children in Canada, is still killing our languages because children are not learning, they're learning the dominant languages in Canada, which is French and English, at the expense of their own language. So as Ted mentioned, that one of the most profoundly significant impacts has been shame. Shame about our identity, shame about our language, and I can tell you that as a language advocate or activist working in Canada, that often our leadership, the ones that went into the schools, still have trouble advancing linguistic rights for Indigenous people because of that barrier of shame. My mother and all her brothers and sisters still can speak our language fluently. My father's no longer around, but they're language advocates, but they do not speak the language to me at home or my daughter. And it's a psychological barrier that is very thick and is something that we're still working with today to heal from that experience. But if you look at a number of the youth on the streets in Canada that are troubled, that have addictions, we have high suicide rates, a lot of that comes from that feeling of lack of self-worth. They don't see themselves in curriculum, they don't see themselves on the streets, they don't see themselves in the school books. The erasure of Indigenous identity is something that we're challenged with, but we're also dealing with the physical and sexual abuse that happened in the schools has trickled down into this generation as well. So the harms that young youth are experiencing are very much impacting their life. And I'm just going to read to you a report that was recently documenting the impact of shame and loss of identity on youth today. Some parents chose not to pass their language down for fear that their children would grow up and face difficulty living in the modern world because it would be hard to know how to speak both our language and English. Traditions were not passed down because our parents' fear of stigma and concern that the practice of certain traditions, such as smudging, which is what we use in our traditional medicines, our sweat lodge and other ceremonies, would be thought to be witchcraft or black magic. I can tell you a lot of my cousin or my uncles still call it that. This feeling of shame about our tradition and culture was taught to our parents as young children in the schools and is still struggled with today in our homes. It's hard to identify as an Indigenous person in mainstream Canadian society when you carry this sense of shame surrounded by people who look down on you. So, Ted and other survivors that attended these schools, their testimonies are critical for talking about what happened. As I mentioned earlier, it wasn't until my early 20s that I found out about the boarding schools. I'm going to talk about the redress. We had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that went across the country, and I would spend at least one day for the whole day in the front row listening to survivors, because I still to this day do not know my father's history. I don't know his experience. I don't know what happened to him, but I know he suffered from severe nightmares every night. I heard them in his room every night. He was very challenged in his sleep. So I know something did happen to him. I'm just not sure what it is. It's also very challenging for families to talk about these experiences as families, because as you imagine, it's traumatizing, and the last thing a parent wants to do is harm their children by talking about these experiences. So I do not talk about these experiences with my mother or my aunts and uncles. When I first started looking into the boarding school, residential school experiences, I went to the library and I picked out books and I read memoirs. So I'm going to talk about the redress that has started to evolve from the residential school system really in the 1990s. And I can tell you that it was individuals like Ted and other survivors that started filing claims against the federal government and the churches that ran the schools for the abuses that they experienced in the schools. Their court claims drove the redress that happened in Canada. So in the 1990s, there was probably a few hundred cases that were filed against the federal government and the churches. At that time, the federal government released a statement of reconciliation. This happened in 1998. And there was a $350 million healing fund that was distributed to work on healing projects. Churches involved had submitted apologies a bit earlier, beginning in the 1986 with the United Church, and churches have started to apologize over the years, and some of you might have heard in the news that Pope Francis is supposed to be coming to Canada to talk to residential school survivors about the role that the Catholic Church played. So, as I mentioned, Ted was one of the ones that filed a court case against the federal government and the churches. By the time I came back from grad school, which was the beginning of 2000, 2003, there were 10,000 claims against the federal government and the churches, the largest number of court claims in the history of Canada on one issue. Lawyers during this period had a very challenging time working with their claims. The federal government had, for example, an army of 100 lawyers working on their team, and can you imagine if you're one lawyer trying to advance a claim against 100 other lawyers? Very challenging. So there was a strategy put in place by a number of lawyers in Canada. They decided to amalgamate the 10,000 claims into a class action suit. The class action suit was a strategy. They knew that the federal government would never be able to address 10,000 claims in this lifetime and maybe in the next lifetime. And they felt that the lawyers that were involved would be better suited to work together rather than, filing these individual claims. So in the end, the Canadian government settled in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in 2006, and this was a very challenging task. You had a number of Indigenous peoples, you had the federal government with their lawyers, you had legal representatives for the churches. It was a huge endeavor. Because of the settlement agreement, so these are individual court cases that were amalgamated into one, part of the settlement agreement required a truth and reconciliation process. And the goal for this Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to document what happened in the schools. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had a head of the commission as well as two other commissioners. So there's three of them that went across the country. They talked to former residential school survivors. They talked to families. They talked to communities. They talked to anyone who was impacted by the schools, including some former teachers, church representatives. There were national events that were held across Canada, 7 national events. I can say that I think Ted went to 6 of them. He was always there providing testimony, personal testimony, publicly. We also had the opportunity for people to give private testimonies. I don't know if he gave a private testimony, but I know he was giving presentations at almost all the national events. He was there hugging people, encouraging them to get up and tell their story. He cried with people. He cried on stage, and he just poured his heart out at these events to ensure that people were encouraged to share their experiences because he was able to do it. There was also a number of community events because these national events were held in very urban centers. We have a lot of northern communities that weren't able to attend the national events, so the TRC tried to go as many communities as they could. They accumulated approximately 7,000 testimonies that are now housed in the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which is in the Winnipeg, Manitoba, where I live, and are looking for students like yourselves, scholars, interested in finding out more about what happened in the residential schools to come and use the testimonies. I think, it would be wonderful to do some comparative research, so I encourage any of you that are interested to go to their website and look at their collection. There was also part of the Truth and Reconciliation process, there was missing children and unmarked grave burials, where there was a stand actually at the events where people would go, and I didn't actually know what it was at the time. I didn't even question it. I was so focused on listening to the testimonies, but I can tell you when this stand was put up, there was always a lineup of Indigenous people looking for people, relatives that had died in the schools, relatives that have been missing, and they don't know where they are. They don't know what happened to them. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had a very small budget to do this very large work. This is actually an endeavor that requires a separate commission, in my view. We are now uncovering a number of unmarked graves, burial sites in Canada. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission predicted that there was probably about 80 places in Canada where there are unmarked graves, and some of you might have heard in the news that we're slowly uncovering more and more of these unmarked graves in Canada. There is a lot of work to do to give voice to those children that never had a voice in this process, and their stories remains untold. So that is another important role that the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation plays, is for people to go and look for their loved ones and find out what happened to the children that are buried in these unmarked graves. So there was private statements, there was, you could write in statements, you could send them in, and there was also a public discussion. And I'm just going to play you a clip here of during the work of the commission when they were going across Canada. So there was a settlement agreement of all these 10,000 claims. There was a commission getting testimony. Finally, Canada provided an apology to residential school survivors. I'm just going to play this. So that was the apology given by Canada. And one of the other, I think, important contributions that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did is they, in their final report, they defined what happened in the residential schools as cultural genocide. And I'm just going to read to you a bit what's here, but also in addition. So in the final report, which is 6 volumes, it's all accessible online. I encourage any of you just to pick up sections of the report. It's a very worthwhile read if you want to find out more in depth about what happened in the schools. So as you can see here, they talk about the goals of Canada's policy were to eliminate Aboriginal governments, ignore Aboriginal rights, terminate treaties that Indigenous peoples had made with Canada to share the land, and through a process of assimilation caused Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist as distinct legal, cultural, social, religious, and racial entities in Canada. The establishment and operation of the schools were a central element of this policy, which can be described as cultural genocide. So the commission was very, I guess, put in a very complicated place. There was a lot of political pressure for them to even call what happened in the schools a genocide. They modified how they defined it as a cultural genocide, but it's still something that is very debated in Canada. They go on to talk about sort of the impetus for the policy. The land was seized. Populations were forcibly transferred, and their movement restricted. So a lot of parents were not even able to leave their communities to go and visit their kids. If they had to have a pass to leave. We weren't able to stand in more than 5 people in some situations because they didn't want parents or leaders to retaliate against the federal government or Canada for what was happening in the schools. Our spiritual leaders were persecuted. Our ceremonies were forbidden. Our spiritual sacred items were confiscated. They were destroyed. And most significantly, families were prevented from transmitting our cultural values, identity, and language onto the next generation. So when we're talking about the residential schools, it's not just the policy of the schools, but also the goals of the government at the time. There were a number of other policies in education as well in law that prevented Indigenous people from passing on the language and culture onto children. So I want to just bring Ted back into the conversation. The first picture is him, in the school in Fort Alexander. In our language, it's called Sagkeeng. He was very much a part of the redress process for reclaiming Indigenous languages and culture. It's not the type of redress that we imagine, after an apology, where people are provided compensation, or that the federal government or Canada is found guilty of a crime. What he did is he talked about his experiences, very traumatic experiences. He wrote a book called Broken Circle, The Dark Legacy of Indian Residential School, which is memoir. He became a pillar for the Indigenous community to talk about the legacy of the residential schools. He traveled across Canada and the US to share his stories, but he also joined forces with a Holocaust survivor who became one of his best friends, Nate Libschniger. And Ted and Nate eventually would not go to public events unless they were together. They provided each other with a lot of comfort and courage to be able to share their stories. So again, I think there's a lot of opportunity for people that have experienced mass violence to come together to share their stories, but also to get to know each other as people. Ted never turned down an opportunity to present with Nate or to talk about the schools. In just over 11 years, Ted spoke at over 1,500 gatherings about his experience in the schools. He talked to young children. He went to universities. He talked to church representatives. His final project was help publishing a book edited by Canadian genocide scholar Andrew Wolford, who commemorated the history and voices of survivors from the Assiniboia School in Winnipeg called Did You See Us? Which is a school that Ted attended. And I want to show you a couple of clips, and then I'll open it up for questions. But I think the most important lesson that I take away from Ted's legacy is that we have to remove the shame. The shame of being Indigenous, the shame of being Cree, the shame of speaking our language. We need to learn to love and cherish our cultural identity. In order to gain self-respect, we need to embrace what it is to be Indigenous. We need to model kindness. We need to teach kids the harm of hatred. And education is key. Not only for children, but also Ted would talk to newcomers that would come into Canada that didn't even know there were Indigenous peoples in Canada. I think that we also need to share experiences of collective trauma amongst people who have experienced genocide. It's through education and talking that I think the healing will begin, but also to ensure that this history is never erased and so that it never happens again. Ted's spirit name was Sabe Van. The word in my language, in Ojibwe, is used to reference Sasquatch, which is a very tall, sacred being. Sabe stands tall. He speaks with honesty and with words from the heart. So I'm going to leave you with one clip from Ted and one of the clips from when the TRC released their final report.
Sorry, the last clip I'm going to just play is when the final report was released. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
You take the questions? Yep. So we are opening the floor for questions, and you don't need to moderate if you can.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so you were talking about how like the children that went to these boarding schools, like generationally, like the trauma, we know this about trauma, like it goes generational, it's kind of like hereditary. I was wondering what kind of like documented studies have come out about that, and kind of like the overall impact of like the generations coming after them.
Okay, that's a good question. I'll just repeat that for people that are on Zoom. So somebody from the audience asked about the intergenerational trauma that occurred from the schools. So, for example, people that didn't attend the schools but their parents did. That's my situation. What kind of study or research has been done? And that's a really important question. I started working on those 10,000 claims when I came back to Canada from graduate school. In 2000, I'd say between 2003 to 2007, I actively looked for research. There was none in Canada at that time. There is now, because of the work of the Commission, but because of organizations and other non-governmental organizations that wanted to do healing work, recognize that the descendants of residential school survivors also experienced trauma. So in 2010, I was invited to be researched. I wasn't the researcher. A woman was doing a research project on the intergenerational legacy of the schools. So she wanted daughters who were parented by mothers who attended the schools. And she wanted us to talk about what it was like to be parented by somebody who attended the school. And I can tell you that was the first time anybody had asked me or any of the women about that. And it was the first time any of us had talked about that. There were some varied reactions. So one of the women I know in particular, she thought, oh, I'm going to just go and talk about the years my mom went and what she did. And she had no idea that she had a very traumatic childhood. And then when we started talking to each other, right down from the way that we folded our towels was exactly, we got up Saturday morning, washed the house out with bleach, because that's what our parents did in the schools. That was replicated in our homes. That woman who didn't think she was impacted started listening to us, and she realized that her mom was not an everyday mom, that she carried trauma in her life. So since 2010, there's a lot of studies. We created digital stories, and that's how I actually became involved in digital storytelling as a methodology to do research. We worked with over 30 descendants of residential school survivors that have created videos. We shared that work with the Commission. We traveled across Canada and the US and shared the videos. There's still a lot of work to do. And we're ranging from people that are doing scholarship in this area, if you go to some of the reserve communities, kids still do not know this history. Aboriginal kids, Indigenous kids. The curriculum is still not being taught in the schools, and I think that is a crime that they're living this legacy and they don't know this history. So the research is varied, but there's still a lot of work to do. So very good question. And then I think you had your hand up at the back too.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thanks for the wonderful talk. I was just wondering, they talk about trying to actually repair the damage for linguistic rights. Do Indigenous languages have any sort of legal rights or official status? I mean, French is protected. Are any native languages?
Yeah. So another good question. Somebody wants to know about the legal status of Indigenous languages in Canada. Do we have Indigenous language rights? There was legislation that was drafted in 2019, so just very recently, that recognizes that Indigenous people have language rights in Canada. The legislation does not define what those rights are. So it just says that Indigenous peoples have Aboriginal and treaty rights to language. It doesn't provide any guarantee to funding. It doesn't define what the right is. And that is a huge gap that we're trying to address in Canada right now. In Canada, kids can go to public school free of charge and learn French or English. There are two official languages. The reason why they're able to go to school in public school and receive that education free of charge is because the French-speaking community and the English-speaking community have defined language rights, constitutional language rights. So in our Constitution, it says that parents of children that speak English or French are able to get to go to school in public at the public's expense. So what we've been saying is that Indigenous people, because of the harm that was done in the schools and other policies, that kids should be able to learn their language in schools. In order to get programs up and running, it's costly. A lot of resources involved. And, French and English programs know that. So right now, Indigenous people are able to access program dollars. But what we're saying is that we need constitutional rights that recognize our right to fund these schools. And so it's still a battle. It's still one of the, I would say, one of the outstanding issues that still continues to harm Indigenous people that we're still working on. Yeah.
Hi. So I have some questions for people in the chat on the virtual Zoom. So I have a question from Anime. Do you think that the Holocaust can or does serve as a reference point for residential school survivors in giving their testimonies?
Yeah, so it does. And I'll resort back to, actually, I'll just share you a personal story. So when I started looking when I found out that my mother, my parents, my grandparents all went to the schools, I started reflecting on my life, and I could see patterns of the violence that, happened in my home weekly, daily. I thought that was normal. When I put the pieces together about the impacts of the schools, I went searching for material, anything that talked about the legacy of the schools, but there was nothing. So I started looking at books on the Holocaust, and I found a book by Helen Epstein, Children of Holocaust Survivors, and I wrote her an email. I told her what I was going through, and she wrote back. And that was huge for me at that time, that somebody's kindness and generosity who didn't know me, would respond. It gave me the courage to start looking deeper into my history. And it was interesting because I moved to Toronto, and I was still communicating with Ms. Epstein at that time, and she said, one of the people I interviewed for the book is in Toronto. And she introduced me to her, and it just turned out that this woman lived 2 blocks from me. So I went to her house, and I only met her once, but she was an artist. She brought me back to her studio, And we talked about silent shame that we lived with. So, yes, I think it is an important, marker, but also I think more importantly, gives us courage to share these stories. Anybody else?
Do you have more questions?
More questions? Okay.
Or the Q&A. So we have one from Raja Kamara from the Northeastern University of Chicago, who you mentioned earlier that you had just recently started learning the native languages of your parents. And I'm very interested in your learning environment, like how these languages are presented in the English context, formal, informal, or something entirely different.
Okay, so my learning process of the language, that's another talk in itself. But what I can say is I had to get rid of the shame that I was carrying first. I had to deal with that. I had to look at what happened in my family. I had to forgive my parents. I had to, I had to dig deep in that personal history. But now, what I can say is the biggest challenges for all Indigenous people in Canada that are trying to reclaim their language. This might sound odd, but it's teacher training. I speak English. I could not go into a classroom and teach somebody how to teach English. That requires skills. It requires a methodology. It requires the ability to assess. It requires, a knowledge of the history too. It's a sensitive issue. So I've been the past 3 years I've been working on a language program for the university that I teach in at home for second language learners like myself. And the biggest hurdle we have right now is to train teachers to teach Indigenous languages. So I'm away from my teaching responsibilities, so I've been doing Zoom classes in Ojibwe. I'm trying to get my mother to at least, we send greetings to each other over the phone. So I'm trying slowly but when I get back to Canada, that is going to be my major goal is to learn my ancestral languages through the means that we have right now.
So I think one last question, because we are kind of advancing in time, and then I also think all the students for coming this, so just wanted to say.
Yes.
The last question.
Okay.
So I do have one last question from the chat, and this is from Samantha Nagarati. Let me see. Hello, thank you so much for this presentation. Despite the fact that residential schools are no longer in operation, what are the ways that Indigenous youth are still impacted and discriminated against in school days and now? And how is manifesting with mental health-wise beyond the generational shame you mentioned? Yeah.
So she talked about the discrimination that continues to have an impact on young people. Well, Indigenous people still carry shame, but there is still a lot of racism from the stereotypes that were presented by Duncan Campbell Scott, by the rationale behind the policy that that we come from a savage culture. We speak a savage language. A lot of kids are raised with those kind of attitudes still. So it plays out in the playground. It plays out in the way that we're treated by government. It plays out in our hospital. People are dying in hospitals right now because they're not being treated properly because they're Indigenous. People are dying on the streets because they're addicted to drugs. We have the highest suicide rates in the world in the Inuit population, and a lot of it is attributed to systemic, overt racism that young kids in Canada continue to deal with on a daily basis. So thank you so much.
No, we have to thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lorena. Everybody for coming. I just want to say that our next talk is on March 2nd. Shades of Agency, Choice, Survival, and Persistence of Jewish Women during the Holocaust in Transnistria. Thanks everybody for coming, and to those on Zoom, thanks for joining us. Please subscribe to our newsletter so that you are informed about the next event. Thank you.